The Sea King's rotors flattened the tussock grass as the first SAS men dropped to the freezing ground. It was the small hours of May 15th, 1982. The wind off Falklands Sound carried the salt of the South Atlantic and the thin, metallic taste of approaching combat. Across a mile of windswept pasture, on a grass airstrip nobody in Whitehall had heard of 3 weeks earlier, 11 Argentine aircraft sat in neat dispersal. 6 Pucarás, 4 Mentors, a single Skyvan transport. Together, they constituted the single greatest air threat to the Royal Navy Task Force then operating in the total exclusion zone. In 6 days' time, Brigadier Julian Thompson's commandos and paras would wade ashore at San Carlos. If those Pucarás were still flying, men would die. Captain John Hamilton of Mountain Troop checked his watch and gave the nod. Around him, the assault element, 30 men of D Squadron, 22 Special Air Service Regiment in DPM smocks and woolen cap comforters, carrying M16s, M203s, Bren guns and satchels of plastic explosive, began to move silently towards the airstrip in pre-arranged sticks. Behind them, somewhere in the darkness off the north coast, 4,500 tons of Royal Navy steel turned beam on to the island. HMS Glamorgan, a county-class destroyer, was preparing to deliver the most ambitious naval gunfire support mission attempted by the senior service in a generation. Her 4.5-inch turrets would reach almost 6 miles inland to suppress the Argentine garrison, while the SAS did its quiet, lethal work. From the carrier HMS Hermes, 20 miles further out, Admiral Sandy Woodward was sweating on every minute his Sea King spent within range of the enemy. It had taken weeks of argument in the War Cabinet. It had taken sleepless nights for Margaret Thatcher, for Admiral Sir John Fieldhouse at Northwood, for the Joint Intelligence Committee assessing every aerial photograph the Nimrods could bring back. It had taken Brigadier Thompson, fretting on Fearless about a flank he could not protect. It had taken Boat Troop, lying for 3 nights in waterlogged scrapes within range of Argentine sentries, while their kit froze solid around them. And it had taken Cedric Delves, the quiet major commanding D Squadron, agreeing to do in a single night what the Fleet Air Arm had so far failed to do from the air. Now it came down to demolition charges, well-aimed automatic fire, and the cold professionalism of men whose regimental motto was "Who dares wins." In the next half hour, the Special Air Service would carry out the most successful single raid in its post-war history. They would destroy 11 Argentine aircraft, neutralize a radar, blow an ammunition dump, and slip back into the darkness with only 2 wounded. They would clear the western flank of the British landing beaches. They would, in a very real sense, save the lives of hundreds of Royal Marines and paras who did not yet know how close disaster had come. None of this was inevitable. 1 ditched Sea King, 1 panicked Argentine sentry, 1 well-placed mortar bomb, and the whole story might have ended in catastrophe. And with it, perhaps, Mrs. Thatcher's government. How did the smallest expeditionary force Britain had dispatched since Suez find itself launching a special forces raid 8,000 miles from home against an airstrip the Foreign Office had to look up on a map? And what did one freezing night on Pebble Island tell us about the Britain of 1982? And the Britain that came after? This is the story of Operation Prelim. The Britain that woke on April 2nd, 1982, to news of the Argentine invasion was a country in genuine shock. Mrs. Thatcher's government, less than 3 years old, had spent its political capital on monetarist economics, inner-city riots, and a punishing recession. Unemployment had touched 3 million. The Royal Navy was in the middle of John Nott's defence review. a review that had already condemned the carriers Invincible and Hermes, the assault ships Fearless and Intrepid, and the ice patrol ship HMS Endurance to early retirement. It was Endurance's withdrawal, signalled to Buenos Aires the previous summer, that had told General Galtieri's junta exactly what London thought the Falklands were worth. The answer, when the moment came, surprised everyone, possibly including Mrs. Thatcher herself. Within 48 hours, the first Sea Lord, Admiral Sir Henry Leach, had walked unannounced into Downing Street in full uniform and told the Prime Minister that the Navy could be at sea in 72 hours. By April 5th, the first ships of Operation Corporate were steaming south from Portsmouth, cheered off by crowds that nobody under 50 had seen for a generation. It was, as one Whitehall mandarin later put it, the last time Britain went to war the way Britain had always gone to war. But sentiment was not strategy. The task force assembled around 2 aging carriers operating a handful of Sea Harriers and Sea King helicopters, 8,000 miles from the nearest friendly port. Ascension Island, leased from Britain by the Americans, became the world's busiest airhead almost overnight. The Foreign Office, under Lord Carrington and then Francis Pym, fought a diplomatic war in New York to keep the United Nations on side and Washington at least nominally neutral. Caspar Weinberger, an instinctive Anglophile in the Pentagon, quietly funneled Sidewinder missiles, satellite intelligence, and aviation fuel to the British. Alexander Haig, at the State Department, attempted shuttle diplomacy that satisfied nobody. By mid-May, the task force had been on station inside the total exclusion zone for a fortnight. The General Belgrano had been sunk by HMS Conqueror on May 2nd, drawing the Argentine surface fleet permanently back into port and converting the war, in operational terms, into a contest between the Royal Navy and the Argentine Air Arms. The result, for the men in the South Atlantic, had been grim. HMS Sheffield had gone down to an exocet on May 4th. Sea Harriers had been lost. Glamorgan herself had taken cannon fire from a Pucará. It was the Pucará that worried Brigadier Julian Thompson most. The FMAIA-58 was a stubby, twin-turboprop ground attack aircraft built for exactly the kind of war the Argentines were preparing to fight on East and West Falkland, low, slow, heavily armed with cannon, rockets, and bombs, and lethal against light infantry in the open. Thompson's commandos and 3 para were due to land at San Carlos on the night of May 20th. The amphibious group would be at its most vulnerable in daylight on May 21st, sitting at anchor in Falkland Sound while stores and ammunition came ashore. If the Pucarás, operating from Pebble Island, barely 20 miles across the water from the landing beaches, could get into the air, the casualty bill among the landing craft could be catastrophic. That single tactical problem dominated every Chiefs of Staff briefing at Northwood through the second week of May. Air attack from the mainland was a known threat that the Sea Harriers could partly handle. Air attack from a local airstrip by aircraft that could be over the beaches in 12 minutes was something altogether more dangerous. Something had to be done about Pebble Island. The Special Air Service had been at war in everything but name for 30 years. From the jungles of Malaya in the early 50s to Aden in the 60s, from Borneo to Northern Ireland to the famous storming of the Iranian embassy at Prince's Gate in May 1980. 22 SAS had become Britain's instrument of choice for jobs nobody else could do quietly. Yet the Falklands Campaign caught Hereford as off guard as it caught everyone else. The regiment's standing commitments, the counter-terrorist team, the Ulster squadrons, the Oman residue, had been built for a Cold War of small wars, not a conventional amphibious campaign in the South Atlantic. Within days of the invasion, however, D Squadron under Major Cedric Delves had been warned off for the south. Delves was a quiet, thoughtful officer, more academic in manner than the regimental cliché. His men were a mixture of veterans of Dhofar and Northern Ireland and younger troopers who had never heard a shot fired outside a range. They flew out to Ascension on RAF VC-10s, drew tropical and Arctic kit in confused succession, and embarked on the destroyer HMS Antrim for the journey south. Their first operation was hardly a triumph. On April the 21st, in support of the recapture of South Georgia, D Squadron's mountain troop attempted to insert by Wessex helicopter onto the Fortuna Glacier. The conditions defeated them. 2 Wessexes crashed in whiteouts. Every man and every Sea King pilot involved later credited the survival of the troop to Lieutenant Commander Ian Stanley, who flew the remaining helicopter through impossible weather to lift them out. South Georgia fell 4 days later. The lesson, that even the SAS could not bend Antarctic weather to its will, was filed away in Hereford for future reference. Now, on board HMS Hermes, by the second week of May, Delves's squadron sat with their kit packed and waited for a target worthy of the effort. Brigadier Thompson and Admiral Woodward provided it. Reconnaissance Nimrods from Ascension, supplemented by signals intelligence picked up by GCHQ-linked sites and the occasional satellite pass, courtesy of Mr. Weinberger, had built up a steadily improving picture of Argentine dispositions. Pebble Island had been on the list from early in the campaign as a probable forward airstrip. By May 9th, photographic intelligence suggested at least 11 aircraft were now operating from the island. The Joint Intelligence Committee in London upgraded the threat to critical. The plan that emerged in the cramped briefing rooms of Hermes was a classic special operations job with all the moving parts that implied. D Squadron's boat troop would insert first by Sea King from the carrier. Their task was to land on West Falkland, cross to the island by Klepper canoe, observe the airstrip and the garrison, and confirm what was there. If the recce was favourable, mountain troop, with air troop in support, would land on a subsequent night, walk to the airstrip, destroy the aircraft and any associated infrastructure, and be extracted before first light. HMS Glamorgan, detached from the carrier screen, would provide naval gunfire support from offshore. The whole operation depended on the Sea Kings of 846 Naval Air Squadron, and on weather windows the task force could not control. On the Argentine side, the garrison was a mixed force. The aircraft were operated by 4 Naval Air Squadron and a detachment of Argentine Army Pucarás. Ground defence rested with around 150 men, mostly conscript infantry under regular officers who had only arrived in early May and were still digging in. They were not bad soldiers, but they were freezing, isolated, and not yet expecting visitors. That was about to change. Boat troops reconnaissance was the kind of operation by which careers in special forces are quietly made. On the night of May 11th, 8 men of D Squadron lifted off Hermes in a single Sea King of 846 NAS and flew at 50 feet across blacked-out water to a landing point on West Falkland. From there they hauled their Kleppers, 2-man folding canoes of a design barely changed since the Cockleshell heroes had used them against Bordeaux in 1942, down to the water's edge and paddled across the half-mile strait to Pebble Island. The Falklands winter had begun in earnest. The wind, when they reached the island, was gusting force 7 from the southwest. Spindrift froze on their smocks. The Kleppers, already overladen with weapons, batteries and rations, shipped water continuously. 1 man fell in trying to clear a swamped craft and had to be revived in a hide. By dawn, the troop had melted into a series of OPs, along the high ground above the settlement, observing through binoculars and starlight scopes whatever the lifting cloud would allow. What they saw by the morning of May 12th was confirmation of what the photographic interpreters at Jarrick Brampton had been arguing. 11 aircraft were present and operational on the grass strip. 6 were Pucarás. 4 were T-34 Mentors, the Beechcraft trainers that the Argentine Navy had armed with rockets and machine guns and was using as light strike aircraft. The 11th was a short Skyvan transport, the kind of stubby, twin-tail, box on wings that the Argentine Coast Guard used to shuttle stores and personnel. There was a small radar installation, an ammunition dump, and a settlement of corrugated iron buildings where the civilian population of the island, barely 24 souls, were being held under loose guard. The garrison was visible, but its weapon pits were not yet covered overhead. Defensive arcs were thin. Patrolling, in a word, was lethargic. Boat troops signalled back to Hermes. The intelligence was as good as anyone could ask for. But there was a complication. The original plan had envisaged mountain troop conducting a deliberate, 2-night assault with detailed demolition of every aircraft individually. The weather, the Sea King's serviceability state, and the operational timetable would not permit it. The landings at San Carlos were locked into the night of May 20th. There was room for one attempt on a single night, and only one. Either the airstrip was hit before then, or it was not hit at all. In the wardroom of Hermes on May 13th, Admiral Woodward, Captain Lynn Middleton of the ship, and Major Delves sat down and rewrote the plan. The reconnaissance had been so thorough that detailed targeting was now possible from the air. The new scheme was brutally simple. On the night of the 14th to 15th of May, Glamorgan and the Type 22 frigate broadsword would detach from the carrier group and run south. 3 Sea Kings from 846 NAS would lift D Squadron, mountain troop forward, the rest providing fire support and a perimeter, onto a landing site west of the airstrip. The men would walk to the airstrip, destroy as many aircraft as possible inside 30 minutes, and walk back. Glamorgan would suppress the garrison with Starshell and 4.5-inch high explosive. Then everybody would go home. The weather, however, did not cooperate. A Force 9 gale closed in on May 13th. Sea King operations from Hermes were impossible. The clock ticked. On Hermes, Delves's men cleaned their weapons. On the high ground above the settlement, boat troop lay in their scrapes and waited, watching the wind blow snow horizontally across the airstrip. The window was closing. On the afternoon of May 14th, the wind dropped just enough. At 17:30, Greenwich Mean Time, Hermes and her escorts began a high-speed run to the northwest under the cover of low cloud. By 23:30, the carrier had reached a launch point some 65 miles north of Pebble Island. The risk was enormous. Hermes was now closer to mainland air bases than Admiral Woodward had ever permitted her to be. He gave the operation a 4-hour window. If the Sea Kings were not back on deck by 0500, he would withdraw without them. 3 Sea Kings lifted in succession. In the cargo bay of the lead aircraft, Major Delves sat with his signaller and the radio. Mountain troop and air troop crouched on the floor, faces blackened, M16s and 66mm anti-tank rockets across their knees. 45 minutes of contour flying through driving rain brought them over the coast. The pilot lifted into a hover 3 feet above the tussock at a point some 6 kilometers west of the airstrip. Closer than the original plan, but the only ground the lead navigator could be sure of in the conditions. The walk-in took almost 3 hours. The ground was a series of frozen bogs broken by stone runs, every step heavy with kit and explosive. Boat troop exfiltrating from their OPs, met the assault force at a pre-arranged rendezvous and led them in. Just after 0700 Greenwich Mean Time, the small hours, local time, mountain troop reached the western edge of the airstrip and began to deploy. The aircraft were dispersed exactly as the recce had described. 6 Pucarás along the southern line, the Mentors towards the centre, the Skyvan further back. Beyond them, the radar, the fuel dump, and the corrugated huts of the settlement. Out at sea, Captain Mike Barrow, on Glamorgan, opened up. Her first star shell burst over the airstrip at 0700 precisely, throwing the aircraft into stark white silhouette. Within seconds, 4.5-inch high explosive began to land around the garrison's positions, fused for airburst. The effect was overwhelming. Argentine sentries, almost certainly half asleep in the cold, found themselves under the heaviest naval bombardment delivered by the Royal Navy in 30 years. In the strobe light effect of the star shell, the SAS went to work. Mountain troops split into pairs. Each pair carried plastic explosive with 2-minute fuses, plus 66mm rockets and M203 grenade launchers for any aircraft they could not reach on foot. The Pucarás were dealt with first. Charges were thrust into intakes and onto wing routes. 66s were fired into engine nacelles at point-blank range. M203 rounds went through canopies. Within 10 minutes, 6 Pucarás were burning. The Mentors went next, then the Skyvan, then the fuel dump. The radar was disabled by satchel charge. The ammunition store went up in a fireball that troopers remembered, with characteristic understatement, as fairly significant. The Argentine response, when it came, was confused and ineffective. A sentry tripped a command-detonated mine that wounded one SAS trooper, the closest the operation came to disaster. Small arms fire crackled in the dark, but the garrison could not locate its attackers under the relentless naval bombardment. An Argentine officer who attempted to organize a counterattack was killed by shrapnel. By 0745, all 11 aircraft were burning or destroyed. Delves ordered the withdrawal. The walkout was a forced march in driving rain. The Sea Kings came back into the hover at 0830. 20 minutes later, every man of D Squadron was on board. As Hermes turned south at full speed to clear the danger area, the orange glow of the airstrip was still visible from the bridge. Operation Prelim was over. By any rational standard, the cost to Britain was extraordinarily light. 2 SAS men were wounded, one by the mine, one by shrapnel from a delayed action bomb that detonated as a charge cooked off prematurely. Both were evacuated to Hermes within hours, treated by the carrier surgeons, and were on their feet within days. No aircraft were lost. No ships were damaged. Glamorgan returned to the carrier screen, having expended around 235 rounds of 4.5-inch and a quantity of star shell that her ammunition officer described in a private signal as a generous evening's work. For the Argentine forces in the Falklands, the picture was very different. 11 aircraft, representing the bulk of the locally based ground attack capability against the imminent British landings, had been destroyed in less than an hour. 6 Pucarás, 4 Mentors, and a Skyvan was a serious bite out of the South Atlantic Theatre Command's order of battle. Buenos Aires reacted with a mixture of denial and recrimination. The state radio initially claimed that British saboteurs had been driven off, leaving behind dead and wounded. Inside the junta, General Galtieri demanded to know how a windswept airstrip on a remote island had become the easy target of a Royal Navy raid. Heads, as the cliché has it, were privately discussed. In London, the news arrived in the small hours of May 15th at the Cabinet Office briefing rooms. Cobra by its institutional nickname. The chiefs of staff allowed themselves a moment of professional satisfaction. Mrs. Thatcher, briefed on the secure line at Chequers, is said to have asked, with characteristic directness, whether any of her boys had been killed. Told that they had not, she repeated the phrase, "Thank God," several times. There were quieter lessons, too, which the Joint Intelligence Committee began to pull together in subsequent days. The naval gunfire support, integrated tightly with the Special Forces ground action, had functioned as a single weapon. This was the kind of warfare the Royal Navy had not practiced at this scale since Suez, and it had worked. The Sea King had again proven itself the irreplaceable workhorse of the task force. The loss of one such helicopter would later, on a single night in the same campaign, deliver the worst losses 22 SAS had suffered since the Second World War. Hereford absorbed both lessons with characteristic silence. But there was a darker undercurrent. The success at Pebble Island had been a function of bold reconnaissance, professional execution, and very considerable luck. The garrison had been complacent. The weather had cleared just in time. The Argentine response had been confused and badly led. Senior officers in the task force were quietly aware that, against a more alert and aggressive defender, the same operation could have ended very differently. One Sea King, ditching on insertion, would have stranded a troop on enemy ground. A single, well-aimed mortar bomb on the assault element could have produced casualties no helicopter extraction could recover. Hereford had walked, in other words, very close to the line. The Falklands Campaign would walk closer still. Within days, on the evening of May 19th, a Sea King ferrying SAS personnel between Hermes and Intrepid suffered what was believed to be a bird strike and ditched into the South Atlantic. 22 men were lost, among them 18 from the regiment, the worst single loss the SAS had suffered since the Second World War. It was a brutal reminder that the same fragile rotor blades on which Pebble Island had depended could turn the other way, without warning, against the men who relied on them. The bill, in the end, was paid in lessons as much as in lives. Pebble Island had bought Britain an operational margin at San Carlos that nobody had been able to guarantee a week earlier. Whether that margin would be enough was about to be tested. The British landings at San Carlos went in 6 nights later, on May 21st, 1982. They were the most demanding amphibious operation conducted by the Royal Navy since the Mediterranean campaigns of 1944. Across 2 days of furious action, Argentine aircraft from the mainland flew almost 200 sorties against the anchorage. They put HMS Ardent, HMS Antelope, and HMS Coventry on the bottom of Falkland Sound. They damaged ships repeatedly. They came close, on more than one occasion, to halting the operation altogether. What they did not do, what they were entirely unable to do, was attack from Pebble Island. No Pucará lifted from the grass strip 20 miles to the north. No Mentor strafed the landing craft. No Skyvan ferried in reinforcements. The aircraft that might have done these things were so much aluminium ash on the wind. The garrison, demoralized and largely cut off, played no further part in the campaign and was rounded up at the war's end. Senior commanders in the task force later put numbers on what Pebble Island had bought. Admiral Woodward, in his Memoirs, calculated that the elimination of those 11 aircraft had saved between 1 and 3 major warships from probable damage or loss. Brigadier Thompson was equally certain that British infantry casualties at San Carlos would have run very much higher had the Pucará, a stable, accurate, slow-flying gun platform, been allowed to operate at low level against the landing beaches. Both judgments were tempered by the customary British understatement, but neither was easy to argue with. The wider campaign, of course, was decided by other things: by Argentine command failures, by the relentless professionalism of 3 Commando Brigade and 5 Infantry Brigade, by Goose Green and Mount Longdon and Tumbledown, by the resilience of Royal Navy ships under air attack, and by the sheer endurance of the task force 10 weeks from home. The Argentine surrender came on June 14th. By the end of June, Mrs. Thatcher was politically untouchable. Within a year, she would call a general election and win a Commons majority of 144. For 22 SAS, the campaign ended in mixed measure. The Sea King crash on May 19th had hollowed out D Squadron. Captain John Hamilton, the mountain troop commander who had led the assault at Pebble Island, was killed on Mount Kent on June 10th while covering his patrol's withdrawal. He was awarded a posthumous military cross. Many in the regiment felt it should have been a Victoria Cross. The Falklands taught Hereford again that special forces could deliver disproportionate effect, but only if the conventional tools, helicopters, naval gunfire, reliable communications, were there to carry them. It was a lesson the regiment would carry into the next decade and beyond, from Northern Ireland to the Gulf, and on into Iraq and Afghanistan. In Whitehall, the strategic conclusions ran deeper. The Knot Defence Review was quietly buried. The carriers were reprieved. Endurance was reprieved. The amphibious ships were reprieved. The Royal Navy emerged from the campaign with a stronger institutional position than it had enjoyed for a decade, and with a renewed argument for capabilities that the Treasury had spent years trying to take away. In Washington, the Reagan administration absorbed the campaign with quiet attention. The British had shown that a middle-rank Western power could still project force at intercontinental range, take casualties, and win. The special relationship, badly bruised by Haig's attempted neutrality, was repaired by midsummer. Caspar Weinberger, the great ally inside the Pentagon, was eventually awarded an honorary K.B.E. And on a windswept airstrip on Pebble Island, the burned-out hulks of 11 aircraft slowly rusted into the grass. What does Pebble Island actually tell us? More than a single night's action on a remote Falklands airstrip should be able to. It tells us, first, that the British way of war did not die with Suez. For a quarter of a century after 1956, the conventional wisdom had been that Britain was a Cold War power, and only a Cold War power, committed to the Rhine, the North Atlantic, and the deterrent, with no real capacity to act independently anywhere else. The Falklands Campaign as a whole, and Pebble Island in microcosm, demonstrated that the conventional wisdom was wrong. A Royal Navy reduced by decades of cuts, an army committed to Germany, and a special forces capability that the Ministry of Defence routinely underfunded, between them put together an operation that nobody in Washington or Moscow believed could succeed. And then it succeeded. It tells us, second, that the relationship between conventional and special forces had matured. The SAS at Pebble Island did not act alone. They acted as the sharp end of a system. Nimrods overhead, GCHQ in the background, a destroyer and a frigate on the gun line, Sea Kings in the air, a carrier task force at sea, and a war cabinet behind them. The men on the airstrip were the visible point of the operation. But the operation depended on a chain of capability that reached all the way back to Northwood, Whitehall, and Downing Street. Special forces of the modern kind, in other words, are an expression of national capability, not a substitute for it. It tells us, third, something about the politics of confidence. Mrs. Thatcher had inherited a country that had, by its own conventional reckoning, lost the habit of believing in itself. The Suez generation had assumed that decline was the natural state of post-imperial Britain. The 70s, with their inflation and industrial unrest, had confirmed the assumption. The Falklands punctured it. And Pebble Island, in its small way, was part of that puncturing. A reminder that British arms, properly used, could still produce results the world would notice. The regiment itself absorbed the operation with the kind of professional understatement that has always been its signature. There was no parade, no public ceremony, no immediate flood of memoirs. Most of the men involved went straight on to the rest of the campaign, then back to Hereford, then on to the next job, in the next country whose name they were not allowed to mention. Some of them, in time, wrote books, most did not. Captain John Hamilton's Military Cross is on display today at the SAS Regimental Chapel. Major Cedric Delves, much later, published a sober and thoughtful memoir of the campaign. The rest, in the regimental phrase, kept their counsel. And 44 years on a windswept island in the South Atlantic, the rusted remains of one or two of those Argentine aircraft still sit in the grass, slowly being reclaimed by the weather. They are the most enduring physical monument to one night's work that any British Special Forces operation has produced. That, perhaps, is the right note on which to leave it. Pebble Island was not the largest battle of the Falklands War, or the bloodiest, or the most strategically decisive. But it was the operation that, in distilled form, contained everything that made the Falklands Campaign what it was. Improvisation, professionalism, very considerable luck, and a willingness to take the kind of risk that other nations would not. If you found this story worth your time, please give the video a like and consider subscribing for more long-form British military history. And tell me in the comments, which Falklands operation do you think deserves a closer look next?